I've been a workplace activist at Fujitsu in Manchester for 25 years now. I'm currently the chair of Unite in Fujitsu across the UK. As it happens, we're currently in dispute at Fujitsu Manchester over pay, pensions and job security. Friday was our 10th strike day and we're on strike again on Monday. My history there, it's a badly organised industry. I think on average about 2% of people are in the union. So it's been a bit of an uphill battle trying to organise it. We've made some headway. I led the first national strike in the industry about 5-6 years ago, which was partially successful, which I reckon is pretty good in the circumstances. And at the moment we've got union recognition in Manchester where I'm based, and we're fighting to try and extend that across the rest of the country. I've got some experience kind of beyond that in the union, both in terms of, I guess, like many activists, things like going to union conferences. I have in the past sat on the regional committee, and I served for 10 years on the union's executive in Allinson and in Unite. So I've seen some of how the union works up to the top level. But I want really to turn to the election, because this is the second time Len McCluskey has forced an election upon us when none was needed. And I think it's been a deeply undemocratic manoeuvre that he's pulled. By forcing the election early, he's triggered it when he was ready for it and no other candidate was. He's got a timetable where there's half the time for nominations that there should have been, and he's made sure that debate within the union about this really important question about the future of our union is curtailed. And I think a lot of members are very angry about that. They see it as a manipulation of the democratic process, when a General Secretary ought to be the guardian of the democratic rights of members. We've had some wins on that though already, because there is that groundswell of anger about the way the election's being manipulated. So initially the union refused to follow its own rules by telling the activists who the candidates were, which is a pretty basic thing. Obviously they were relying on the fact that they might know that Len McCluskey was standing again, hoping to ignore the rest of us. And that was overturned after I complained to the returning officer. And we've now also had a win where I've been calling on the other candidates to have hustings. They've both been complaining about being misrepresented in the press, which is hardly a surprise. They're not exactly sympathetic to trade unionism. But of course the press are going to misrepresent trade unionists trying to have a serious debate about the future of our union. So we need to have hustings where members can actually hear the arguments properly for themselves, ask questions, debate things out. And I was absolutely delighted that Thursday night we saw the first hustings of the election, all the candidates invited, and a really good debate and discussion. Now that, in my opinion, should be happening in every region around the country. Let's cut the hostile press out of this equation as much as we can and have the members deciding based on the actual arguments and what's in our interest. So I think that's a good start in terms of trying to balance the heavily slanted playing field a little bit so that it's the election's conducted on the merits of the arguments. Now, in my opinion, Len hasn't been a bad General Secretary, but I think there's a huge gap between what we've got in the union and the needs of members. We're still seeing jobs under threat week in, week out. We're still seeing downward pressure on pay and conditions. We're seeing our rights under attack. We're seeing our services being destroyed. And I don't think we can afford to see this election turning into a contest between Gerard Coyne trying to turn the clock back to the days when we supported New Labour, a failed experiment that lost the last two elections, and also industrially, who's looking towards really going back to what we call a servicing model, where the members take a completely passive role in the union, and it's about value for money is the phrase he keeps bandying around, and it's all about having a cheap and ineffective union. And that strategy was pursued in the 80s, and it was a disaster for the trade union movement. It lost sight of the fact that our strength comes from the activity and participation of members. It frittered away that strength, and it saw membership and influence and power decline. We can't have a situation where the choice members are presented with is between turning the clock back with Coyne and just more of the same with McCluskey. That's a complacency that is not justified by the experience of most members in the workplace. And I want to talk a little bit about how I think what we're doing in Unite at the moment falls short of what's possible. We keep missing opportunities. I think one of the most important recent examples was when you had the junior doctors strike, when that incredible action by a group of workers who are hardly your stereotypical strikers, but they had the Tories on the ropes over their attacks on the NHS. Why didn't we call a national demonstration in defence of the NHS in the middle of that crisis for the government over their attacks on the NHS? Why weren't we pushing to coordinate action with the junior doctors? That was even proposed at the TUC General Council, but apparently was laughed out of the meeting. You look back to the fight over public sector pensions, where the momentum of that was frittered away. Again, a missed opportunity. You look at the deadlines that we could have exploited around the London Olympics, where a massive construction programme, we could have used that to really highlight and tackle the scourge of blacklisting in the construction industry. You look at the dispute up at Grangemouth, where we ended up seeing 2 key conveners losing their jobs. We saw an employer just attacking a member's rights, and instead of taking up that fight, we got distracted by a battle inside the Labour Party and lost the plot in terms of winning the industrial dispute. And then one that thankfully is still live, though I think we've missed some opportunities already, is around the Trade Union Act. Unite was absolutely right to point out what an affront it is to workers' rights and how it's an attempt to restrict workers' ability to stand up for themselves. But where was the campaign? It amounted to little more than a bit of parliamentary lobbying. And I think we missed a trick by not connecting the Tories' attack on workers' rights through the Trade Union Act with the wider picture about an increasingly repressive state. There's plenty of people who are angry about the Tories' plans to attack the Human Rights Act or the European Convention on Human Rights. We've got the scandals around the state involvement in blacklisting and the behaviour of undercover cops spying on protesters. We've got increasing surveillance, whether that's CCTV or the recent Snoopers Charter, the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act. You've got kettling and arrests and bail conditions used to deter protesters. We've got movements campaigning against police violence and racism. You've got the attempts to scapegoat and marginalise and silence Muslims with the Prevent agenda and anti-terror legislation. And you've got the appalling treatment of refugees and migrants. Closer to home for many trade unionists, we've got the government's attempt to remove access to justice by absolutely ridiculous tribunal fees and other changes to the legal process. And the irony of it is we've got Unite members involved in pretty much all of those campaigns, and yet we treat them like they're all separate. And we treat our attempts to oppose anti-union legislation as if it was some niche issue only of concern to trade union activists. And then, surprise, surprise, we get faced with politicians who say, well, even if we wanted to, we couldn't get support for repealing the anti-union legislation because there's too much public support for it. We need to get off the back foot on these issues and actually have conferences around the country, bringing together those people campaigning on. There's fantastic campaigns on all of those issues. Bring those people together and try and get a positive movement going for civil rights and human rights. And I think, though it would have been better if we'd done that before the Act came in, we could do that now. We're going to have to get used to the idea that effective action may mean members having to go outside the law. We've already seen examples of that from construction, not only in terms of people defying the anti-union legislation, but taking direct action. There's loads of campaigns that we could learn from where people have got skills in doing that. You look at the anti-fracking protesters, which has been certainly a big issue round my way. One of those human rights issues, in my opinion, and workers' rights issues, is around free movement of labour. Gerard Coyne, the right-wing candidate in this election, has made clear that he wants to see restrictions on workers' rights to travel. Len McCluskey hasn't gone that far, but he is calling for unequal treatment in access to jobs, that actually where you're from should determine whether an employer can hire you. And I don't believe this is the time to see any fudge or backsliding on equality in any aspect of our union. The reality is that members of Unite, just like the working class as a whole, are made up of people from all around the world. And we're strongest when we're united, and we cannot be united if we give an inch to the idea that somehow immigration or immigrants are responsible for attacks on jobs, pay and conditions. We have to champion those rights of workers to be able to travel and to be treated equally. I think more generally we need to see more integration of our equality work, including the young members' work, into our industrial work. Because I think the equality structures in Unite have two fundamental functions. Firstly, they're a route to get involved for people who might find that there are barriers to participation. And that can help build people's confidence and experience that they're able to participate through the rest of the structures. And they're also a voice on certain key issues that might otherwise be marginalised within the wider union. But we sometimes lose sight, I think, of the fact that equality and young members' issues are industrial issues. They're not separate in some way. And I think whether you talk about free movement and workers' rights against discrimination, those run right through every issue in the workplace. You think about how pay is done in many workplaces with performance-related pay, almost always discriminatory. You look at redundancy selection, almost always discriminatory. We ought to be integrating those issues into our core industrial work much, much better. We have to win an argument with members, and it is sometimes an argument, that a strong union needs solidarity, and that means active opposition to oppression, not just ignoring it and hoping it will go away. And the same has to apply within the union as well, where there are too many examples of bullying, harassment and unfair treatment of people employed by the union. I think one of the issues certainly that the press likes to focus on in this election is its relationship with the Labour leadership and Jeremy Corbyn. I think the truth is that Len has undermined Corbyn by his position on free movement, as well as his position on Trident. He's also supporting vanity projects like HS2, Heathrow expansion and Hinkley Point. These don't create jobs, as is often argued. They're jobs destroyers because they divert precious funds that could be used for socially useful things that would generate far more work. Why aren't we campaigning for 1 million climate jobs rather than these vanity projects? I think it's important Unite continues to support Jeremy Corbyn because he's supporting us on so many key issues. And that means continuing Unite's work within Labour's structures. But the reality is, though what McCluskey's done internally within Labour Party structures has been positive recently on Corbyn, he hasn't been a reliable ally, and he won't be a reliable ally in the future because he is to Corbyn's right on many of those issues. Because what Corbyn represents to some extent is a break from a neoliberal consensus in politics that's existed for far too long. And that's a big deal. That's not going to be overturned overnight. We've had a media and a political establishment that have pushed the idea that there's no alternative to the market for far too long. And breaking that and actually Corbyn being able to win an election means winning arguments with a lot of people. And that means that just supporting Corbyn through Labour's internal structures won't be enough. It'll take political support outside. You just look at where the attacks on him come from. You see the Labour right not saying we disagree with this or that policy most of the time, but pointing to the polls. They're saying it's the polls that mean we have to get rid of Corbyn. And that's reflected also in McCluskey's lukewarm support for his leadership, which even this week he was saying was still in question, his leadership qualities. Corbyn's at his most popular when he's very direct and very principled. That's why people elected him, because they liked somebody who stood up and spoke out for what was right, rather than the focus groups and spin that we'd had from New Labour. And the pressure that McCluskey puts on Corbyn to accommodate to the right undermines Corbyn's own support. Action within the Labour Party alone, important though it is, won't be enough to ensure that Corbyn wins a general election, not just a Labour leadership election. That'll need campaigning over the issues directly. It's only action that changes minds on a big scale and shifts the focus away from the Westminster bubble and the media towards the actual issues and connects what Corbyn's saying with the general population. I think some of the other key issues we're going to face are around the aftermath of Brexit. There's a lot of debate going on in the union about what our attitude towards the single market should be and so on. And I think we should have no truck with the idea that we have to choose between a kind of protectionist backing of some employers who want to be protected from foreign competition on one hand and a demand for free trade to boost exports for other employers on the other. We have to have an independent position that's about what's in workers' interests. The reality is that though the EU has provided some sort of safety net for workers against some of the worst things that governments have wanted to do, in many ways a bit like how the House of Lords has somehow sometimes vetoed some of the worst aspects of UK government legislation. It's also acted as a ceiling to restrict what governments can do. Now, our governments in the UK have been so bad we've barely noticed that ceiling. But the experience of Syriza in Greece should be a warning to us. If we succeed in getting a Corbyn government in the UK, we should be under no illusion that the EU and its single market, if we remain in that, will restrict that. We saw the commitment to that kind of neoliberal free trade model with TTIP too. So what I'm arguing is that we don't need to revisit all those arguments around Brexit, which divided our membership as they divided the country. What we need to do is move away from focusing on backing this or that section of our employers and towards putting workers' rights first. I think it's a disgrace that the Unite response to Brexit on our terms is the booklet called. If you look for where workers' rights appear in this, and of course tearing up workers' rights was a huge part of the Tories' agenda, those who are for leaving the EU. Where does it appear? It gets a mention on page 28. All the rest of it is about what's good for our employers, not what's good for us. In this election, I'm the only candidate that shares the experiences and frustrations of members firsthand. When you're in dispute or when you've got a big issue, it should feel in Unite as if you've got 1 million members behind you, not as if you're being left on your own to fight your own battles. There should be, the initiative there was a few years ago about setting up a dispute unit to support disputes. That should be there for all disputes, not just a few high-profile ones. Communication in the union is absolutely shocking. Half the time, even activists don't know what's going on. I had a ridiculous example where a workplace a few hundred yards from my own, Kernan Nagel, was on strike. We only found out through the local papers a couple of days before it happened. We should be mobilising our members to support each other. That's where our strength comes from. So one of the things I'm arguing is that there should be at least a fortnightly email bulletin to every activist, not filtered through all the officers and committees to keep people in the dark and select who's in the know. And I think one of the other key arguments coming from COIN is the idea that we should have a freeze on subs to give members value for money, which I mentioned earlier. I think this is simply irresponsible. The question of whether union membership is good value for money is about how effective the union is, not how cheap it is. It's much better to have an effective union you can pay a little more for than an ineffective union, however cheap it is. I want to turn to some of the arguments about organising, something that I think has been neglected in the campaign far too much. There are some really good examples, I think, in the union of people creatively trying to grapple with the problems of organising in the 21st century workplace. Certainly in our dispute in Fujitsu, where at the moment we've got 1,800 jobs under threat, we had to scrabble around trying to find examples of where people had successfully fought offshoring. And we found some, but we didn't find them through the official Unite structures. We found them on the grapevine by talking to people. What we should be doing is producing case studies of where members take successful approaches in fighting or organising, that we write those up and make them available to all activists, that we're not spending all our time reinventing the wheel. You look at an example from Rolls-Royce of the strike fund they've set up across their combine to support different members taking action. Why aren't we generalising that? That's something in Greater Manchester I've been promoting that we try and do across the city, to set up a strike fund to support a minimum standards campaign. Within my own company, in Fujitsu, we've been experimenting with using conference calls to reach out to members who may not be in the largest workplaces. That's something that's a common experience in many employers. And what I've found as I've been looking at the state of Unite and the state of the union is that my own experience in Fujitsu, which I thought was maybe a little bit unusual in having a multi-site employer where we were struggling to get coordination, is actually the majority experience. It turns out that 80% of workplaces where there are 10 or more Unite members are in employers that span multiple regions of the union. And nearly all the power and resources of the union go through the regions. That's an absolutely perfect structure for the mid-19th century, when maybe you were looking at your local mill owner as as who you were fighting against, and maybe the local employers clubbed together to try and take on the unions. It's completely unsuited to the 20th century, never mind the 21st century. So I'm arguing there needs to be a review of Unite structures to give much more support to setting up national combines for the majority of workplaces that are in multi-site, multi-region employers, and on strengthening the sectors rather than doing everything through regions. I think there needs to be much more lay involvement in organising. That can't be something that's done to us. It has to be something that we're all involved in. And I think as part of that, we have to end the exclusion of retired and community members from the structures of the union, and involve them in building up the existing scheme for lay companions, so we don't have officers spending huge amounts of their time chasing around after individual casework when they should be doing more strategic stuff around organising and collective action. We're also going to have to overhaul Unite Education. The government's absolutely savaging FE funding, and that's hitting union training as well. It's having its funding cut. And we need to take advantage of that. I know that sounds a little bit bizarre, but we've been constrained by that funding into what we deliver in our education to try and get certification for the courses. We need to take advantage of that freedom to make sure the training is what we actually need, rather than just to tick a box for FE funding. And we need to ensure that we have fair treatment for the tutors that are working for us, and not have people on 0 hours contracts. Above all, I think there needs to be a culture shift in the union towards a more bottom-up approach. because the key is building members' power. That's how we win things at the end of the day. There's been a lot of talk, I think, from the right in this election campaign about corruption. Sometimes people say all power corrupts, and I think that's a mistake. I don't think it's power at the top corrupts. I think it's our powerlessness at the bottom that corrupts the people at the top. And I'm putting forward some ideas to try to change that. One of them is arguing for election of officers to reduce the power of patronage that comes from the top of the union, even where the General Secretary isn't necessarily involved in every single appointment to a job. They absolutely are involved in who gets which job and moving people around and so on. So reducing the power of patronage would help that. And part of that power of patronage creates a climate of fear within the union. It's amazing the number of people who work for the union who've contacted me saying they support the campaign, and yet they're afraid to say so publicly for fear of retribution. That can't be right. I'm also arguing that if I'm elected, I'll stay on my current salary. I think it gives a hostage to fortune to the right-wing press when we're complaining about fat cat employers and they're able to say the same about our own union. I want to address what I think is the best argument for not supporting me, which is a fear of splitting the vote and letting Coyne in, because he is awful. I've talked about how he's a mouthpiece for the Labour right, how he supports a servicing approach to trade unionism, about how he's calling for more immigration controls. He's a supporter of Trident. In effect, he's appealing to all the worst instincts of our members. But I think we have to remember that it's Len who's chosen to gamble the future of the union by calling this completely unnecessary union. And I think it's a reflection of the weakness of the case for McCluskey staying on, that his supporters are having to rely so heavily on an argument that you have to support McCluskey because Coyne's so bad, rather than taking on what I'm arguing is needed for the future of a stronger union. There's also an argument saying that, so the arguments they're relying on is a combination of saying that I lack the experience to be General Secretary is one of them, or of splitting the vote. In terms of experience, I think there's plenty of people at the top of the union who've got experience of being at the top of the union. What there isn't is anybody at the top of the union who's got the experience of being at the bottom of the union, and I think that's a huge gap. It's worth remembering that Mark Sawatka, when he was elected, came straight off the front line as a workplace activist, and I don't think anybody, whatever they think of different things he's done, would argue that having lacked experience as a union officer prevented him being an effective General Secretary. I think the argument about splitting the vote, however, exaggerates the support for Coyne. If you look at the endorsements Len McCluskey is now claiming, it's clear that the overwhelming majority of the union machine is behind McCluskey. Almost every senior officer in the union is backing him. And they're exaggerating the threat from McCluskey, pointing sometimes to votes that the right wing got 2 or 3 elections ago to try and scare people into voting McCluskey, despite the fact that what he's standing for is inadequate. It's worth remembering that Jerry Hicks beat the right-wing candidates in both the last elections, and since then there has been progress in the union. You know, we came from a period when the two parts of the union, Amicus and T&G, were fighting like rats in a sack. Things have stabilised, and Len has strengthened his hold on the union machine, which I think is reflected in his endorsements. Now, there's no doubt that there will be people who will vote for me who would have supported McCluskey if I wasn't standing, for lack of a better option. But there's also non-voters. There's people who wouldn't have supported either of the 2 establishment candidates who are saying they're going to support me in this campaign. And there's also people who are discontented with the status quo that I've spoken to, who would never back McCluskey after some of the things that have happened, and who are tempted by Coyne, and if there wasn't a left-wing alternative, could be pulled to the right. I'd argue that defence of an inadequate status quo is a bad place for the left to be. It's the argument that was used by Len McCluskey to back Burnham against Corbyn. It's the argument that Clinton's supporters use to argue against backing Bernie Sanders and letting Trump in. And the other way of looking at this situation is that McCluskey and Coyne are splitting the establishment vote, and that's actually creating an opportunity to have a more radical change. And I want to finish really by talking about that opportunity. We're already seeing support from activists on the North Sea, right through to in the finance sector in First Direct. People are fed up with partnership, with passivity, with the remote union and unaccountable officers. People are angry at McCluskey being pulled to the right by Coyne and pulling Corbyn to the right as well. Running a campaign for a rank and file activist to stand and the left candidate is an opportunity to put key arguments into the union, whether you're talking about the argument about free movement or the arguments around organising. It's an opportunity to build a network of activists in every area and every sector committed to a bottom-up activist organising approach. And that will be vital whoever wins this election, that is strengthened as much as possible, because that's where the strength of our union comes from. This isn't going to be an easy campaign. The election is skewed, but we've already won some victories over that. The email that went out to activists, the fact that there's hustings, the fact that the TV is starting to cover our campaign. But we're going to have to fight for absolutely every nomination to make sure that I'm on the ballot paper. And I'd just remind everybody, it would be foolish to rule out an upset after the last 18 months. We've seen Corbyn, we've seen Brexit, we've seen Trump, right? I think the establishment candidates would be unwise to rule out the possibility of another upset. Sawatka did it. It's possible in Unite too. This isn't about me, it's about members and activists collectively shaking up the union and saying we deserve better than what we've got at the moment. Just imagine the earthquake through the movement if we did that in Unite.